Welcome back to Franklin Covey's twice weekly podcast on leadership with Scott Miller. That's me. I'm your host, 6.5, almost 7 years running, where we have interviewed, can you believe, nearly 500 episodes featuring conversations with many of the world's most influential thought leaders, authors, CEOs, entrepreneurs, creators, artists, scientists, academics, discoverers, people that have dedicated their lives, their research to helping improve our own lives. Franklin Covey, of course, co-founded by the famed author Stephen R. Covey nearly 40 years ago, who, of course, wrote the seminal book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Franklin Covey, known to millions as the world's most trusted leadership firm, sponsors this podcast in the hopes to pour into you, to make you a better leader, more highly effective, and help you achieve your own great purposes. Each week, we have broad-ranging conversations on both audio and video every Tuesday and Friday so that you can have access to some of the greatest minds. Today, our guest is a remarkable gentleman, although American by citizenship, in residence, if you will, at Cambridge University for nearly 3 decades. His name is Venki Ramakrishnan, and he is the Nobel Prize winner in chemistry. He shared this prize with another scientist. Dr. Venki is joining us today to talk about his new book, Why We Die. Tagline, The New Science of Aging and the Quest for Immortality. Venki, welcome to today's podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
It's a pleasure to be with you. I think you are our first Nobel Prize winner? Maybe. Will you remind us, what is it like when that call comes? I know you shared that prize with another fellow colleague in chemistry. Were you thinking? Were you surprised? How does the information come and how does it change your life?
Well, it was a strange day because I had a flat tire halfway on my way to work. I bicycled to work, and so I got to work late. And then this phone rings, and I'm already pretty irritated. And then when a woman says, "Look, I'm calling from the Swedish Academy. I have some important news. Can you hold the line?" I immediately suspected a prank because I have friends, including friends in Utah, I should add, my former colleague in Utah. And I thought one of them was pulling my leg by pretending that I'd won the Nobel Prize. And it took me a while for it to sink in. There were reasons why I thought I wouldn't get it. I felt the field would get it eventually because it's an important field. But I wasn't sure I'd be one of the 3.
But you were, and so at some point, did you quickly realize this isn't a prank, this is a life-changing recognition for you and your colleagues?
Oh, yeah, definitely. In fact, even during the call, there were people on the committee whom I knew, so I knew it was real. And then one of them said, "Well, enjoy the last 30 minutes of peace you'll have in your life," because they announced it 30 minutes after the phone call. So it was kind of true. For a couple of years, I had very little time to myself, but it's settled down now, so it's okay.
Well, what a fabulous recognition of you and your colleagues' dedication to research. Remind everybody, although the prize was shared in chemistry, there was some interesting science that came into that. Talk a little bit about the research you all did to achieve this recognition.
Well, the work that was awarded the prize was called the structure and function of the ribosome. Now, most people have heard of DNA, but most people don't know what a ribosome is. And the fact is, without the ribosome, DNA would essentially be a silent, inert material. What DNA has is our genes. And what these genes are units of information on how to make different proteins. So each gene codes for a particular protein. Now the DNA isn't used directly. It's converted to something called mRNA. So each stretch of DNA containing a gene is copied to mRNA. Now mRNA is something that nobody had heard of until the COVID pandemic, but now we've all shot mRNA into our arms through the vaccines. And that mRNA that we shot into our arms simply contains the instructions for how to make the coronavirus spike protein so that it essentially triggers our immune system to react to it. So every gene is like that. There's an mRNA, but that mRNA then has to be read and the protein has to be made. And that's made by a giant macromolecular complex, a giant molecular complex. In fact, if you look at the picture behind me, you can see in blue and orange right next to my bicycle helmet, that's a model of the ribosome. And it actually has about 500,000 atoms. So you can think of it as a giant translating machine that zips along the mRNA, reads the genetic code, and makes proteins according to those instructions. And that's how every one of the thousands of proteins in our cells are made. And those proteins go off and do everything that we think of as characteristic for life. For example, the reason you can see is because there's a protein in your eye that senses light. The reason you can use oxygen is there's a protein that captures oxygen from your lung and delivers to your muscle. The reason your muscles can even contract is because there are proteins that slide next to relative to each other and contract the muscle. Those are proteins. Antibodies that fight off infections are proteins, and even memory is formed by proteins. So you can think of, you can't imagine modern life without proteins. And the ribosome is right at that crossroads between genes and the proteins that they encode.
I want to get into your book, Why We Die, but since you brought it up, I'd like to just segue and ask your opinion about a very popular topic here in the U.S. Although you are an American citizen, you are residing in Cambridge, performing research there, and that is
I'm in my own bubble.
In your own
bubble. I'm in my own bubble here.
About vaccines, right? There is an enormous amount of debate and misinformation, outright lies, being propagated in the U.S. around vaccines. And then there are also smart questions being asked, right, around the safety and the impact of them. You know, obviously, Dr. Fauci has become a pariah to some group of people in the U.S., not myself, nor is the NIH. And I think there's a tremendous amount of misinformation, disinformation from some malintended people and some well-intended people. Will you just take maybe a minute as the gentleman who shared the Nobel Prize in chemistry, and I'm sure someone will find a reason why that's not legitimate. I don't care. Will you just opine for a moment on what your opinion is based on experience and research on the efficacy of vaccines, what is true, what is not true from your perspective, just so that maybe you can tamp down some of the misinformation from your point of view as a Nobel Prize winner?
The first thing is, people seem to have very quickly forgotten what the world was like before vaccines. In fact, vaccines have extended health and lifespan almost more than anything, certainly more than antibiotics have. And, I grew up in a world where there was still polio, there was still smallpox, measles was rampant. And I know kids who died of polio or people who were, crippled because of polio. And you don't see that anymore. And because you don't see it, you forget the effect of these vaccines. Now, what these people are asking for, the people who are against vaccines, they're asking for some theoretical 100% safety. There is no such thing. But what we have to ask is, what is the consequence of not having vaccines? And the consequence of not having vaccines or not using vaccines is far, far worse than using the vaccine. And it's the same with the COVID vaccine. What people complained is that this is a new technology. Well, that's because they didn't understand the underlying molecular biology. As I explained to you, proteins are made by the ribosome. It translates mRNA. Now, you could make the protein in the lab and inject the protein as a vaccine. That's a more traditional kind of vaccine. But the new kind of vaccine says, why don't we inject the mRNA and let the cells themselves make the vaccine and make the protein, and that presents it better. And so there's some reason to suspect that vaccine actually works better. And so you can think of it as really an advance, but really using the same idea of making the protein of a virus to fool the immune system into thinking it's a foreign, it's not fooling, it's a foreign protein. The immune system recognizes it. Then when a real virus infects you, it's already seen that protein and it says, aha, I know this is a foreign agent and I'm going to attack it. It's already primed. And that's how all vaccines work. So I just, I think the idea that, vaccines are harmful, it's just not correct. I think it is, what is true is that vaccines need to be tested. They need to be tested for safety, for side effects, for efficacy. And every vaccine that's been approved has gone through that process. Even in the middle of the pandemic, there were trials to make sure that the vaccine was okay. And then more extensive trials were conducted all through the pandemic. So, and then finally, I should point out, I don't understand why this is even a political question. In the US, it's slightly politicized. People on one side of the aisle are more vaccine skeptical than people on the other side. Science should never be political. It should be about the data. And I should remind people that it was President Trump who initiated the Warp Speed program and put billions of dollars into rapid vaccine development, which actually saved millions of lives. So, and he himself took the vaccine. And he took the booster shots. So I don't really understand the politics of it.
I appreciate your point of view. My father's twin brother caught polio in high school and spent many years in an iron lung and died from polio with paralysis. And so I have not forgotten.
It used to be very common.
Yeah, it made COVID look like the flu, right? Polio. Let's move on. Thank you for the clarification. I appreciate providing the audience for you to bring sanity to an otherwise insane conversation. Why we die. Why do we die? Other than the outliers of an aneurysm or a stroke or a car accident or, God forbid, something more tragic, sans the outliers, remind us why we die.
Well, when I wrote this book, it is precisely not about those kinds of death, like accidents, getting an infection or being attacked or something. It is really about the natural process that leads to death, namely aging. So you could think why we die is really because we age. And what happens when we age is we accumulate changes and damage to our entire system, from our molecules to our cells and tissues. And these very slowly lead to loss of function. So things just don't work as well as they used to, and then stop working altogether. And if some critical system fails, for example, your brain or your heart, then the entire body can no longer survive as a whole entity. And that's what we mean by death. Now, I should point out there's a weird paradox here, and that is when we're alive, millions of cells in us are dying all the time. And in fact, many of them are required to die for us to continue to live. On the other hand, at the moment of death, most of our cells are still alive. That's why we can be organ donors. And of course, but when we die, those cells all start decaying and dying, and eventually everything's dead. But at the moment of death, most cells are still alive. So what do we mean by that moment of death? It means that's the point when we've stopped being able to work as a whole unit, as a whole being. And it used to be defined by when your heart stopped beating, but then with medical advances, people figured out that they could actually resuscitate you. And so today, most states and most countries regard brain death as a sign of death.
Doctor, talk about this concept called LQ, and why does it matter, and how does it impact us in terms of our comparison to other animals or mammals or organisms? I found that fascinating in the book.
Yeah, this is LQ, I think, is a term invented by Stephen Ostad, who's a distinguished researcher in aging in the US. I think he's at the University of Alabama. Anyway, he coined this term because it turns out that different species live have very different lifespans. Now, why is that? Because we're all made of the same material. So if we have damage and so on, why is it that it accumulates at different rates in these different species? Well, that's because scientists believe that evolution doesn't really care about how long you live. It only cares about how successful you are at growing up and reproducing, because it's the genes you pass on that are being selected for. So if you're a mouse, you have a choice. You have limited resources. Do you spend that on maintenance and repair so that it can keep your body alive for a very long time? Or do you use those resources to grow as fast as you can, mature quickly, and have lots of offspring? Well, in the case of a mouse, evolution has selected the path where the lifetime isn't very long, because there's no point in a mouse living for 40 years. It's going to be eaten or die of starvation or drought or a flood long before it ever reaches old age. And so in the mouse, evolution has selected for rapid growth and maturation. Now, if you take a large animal like an elephant or a whale or a Greenland shark, which can live for 400 years, the equation's a bit different. There, it turns out it pays off to live longer from this point of view of being able to successfully reproduce. So if you plot this graph of, say, mammals, size versus lifespan, they roughly fall along a straight line. There's a lot of scatter, but there's roughly a straight line, so that larger animals live longer, small animals live shorter. But there are some weird outliers. And for example, let's take a bat, a small brown bat called Brandt's bat. It can live for 40 years, even though it's about the same weight as a mouse. Why? Well, a bat can fly around, and so it can escape predators much more easily than a mouse can. It can also forage over a much wider area. And they hang out in ceilings of caves where they're not easily attacked. So in the case of the bat, it's been advantageous for a bat to live longer and then produce even more offspring. And so what people like Ostrad did was, let's give each species an LQ, which is a longevity coefficient, which is what its lifespan should be based on its size versus what its lifespan actually is. So that ratio of the actual lifespan to what you might expect it to be is called that LQ, or longevity coefficient. And I should point out, humans are off the line also. We're also outliers. We live much longer than you'd expect given our size.
Probably due to airbags in cars. Who lives the longest and why?
Well, you mean among humans?
Yeah, among humans. Yeah, is it by race? Is it by diet? Is it by generation? Like, well, what are some of the things that we can learn from those who are living the longest and why they are?
Sure. Well, let me first go into how long we can expect to live at all. And I'd say the record holder is a French woman called Jeanne Calment, who lived to be 122. And by the way, she smoked a cigarette and had a glass of port every day for at least into her hundreds. And she also ate 2.5 pounds of chocolate a week. So you can't go by her lifestyle. She simply was lucky. Okay. But so the people who live really very long, like 110 and so on, are really extreme outliers, because they have some weird combination of genes, of their life history and their lifestyle, and just pure luck. They didn't happen to get infected or get cancer or things like that. So we can't be quite sure what we can learn from them, although people are doing systematic studies to see if they have something that could be generally useful to all of us. But what we do know from all of the biology of aging that has come out in the last 40 or 50 years is that there are some things that we definitely can do. And the three things I would point out is to have a moderate and healthy diet. And this is because studies have shown that if you restrict calories in animals, they live longer and they're healthier. So diet is one thing. The other is exercise. And of course, when you exercise, I would suggest doing both load-bearing or resistance exercise like weights and also cardiovascular exercise. And that'll prevent both muscle loss and keep your heart and your lungs and cardiovascular system healthy. And the third thing that's often ignored, especially in America, is sleep. And it turns out sleep is when a lot of the kind of garbage disposal and maintenance activities of the body and the cells go on. And so that's when a lot of the renewal occurs to the wear and tear and the damage that's occurring during the day. And so sleep is extremely important. Now, these three aren't independent, because if you exercise, you're also likely to sleep better. And if you exercise and sleep well, you're also more likely to eat well. And because often people under stress tend to eat badly. And stress is another aspect. It's shown that increased stress can be bad for your aging processes. But of course, exercise and sleep will also help reduce stress. So there's lots of commonalities there. And then there are a couple of weird, I mean, not weird, but interesting social observations that I should point out. One of them is that it turns out people who are not isolated, but who are well connected, have a good network of friends and community, they tend to live longer than people who are isolated and lonely. A part of it could be that people who are isolated and lonely are depressed and they have other physiologies that may cause them to die earlier. But that's a very strong observation. The other observation is that people who have a sense of purpose seem to live longer. And this is an argument for always having some goal in life. And it could even be after you retired, you could be doing projects or volunteer work, or any volunteer work would actually solve both of those problems. You'd meet people and you'd be having a sense of purpose. So these are some of the things we can actually do. And of course, there are medical things we can do. For example, everybody over a certain age should get tested for diabetes, high cholesterol, and blood pressure, because they're very easily treated and they can keep you healthy in old age.
Can you talk a bit about the environmental impact on our health and wellness as well? Are there some obvious or emerging environmental factors that are decreasing longevity? As in, should we not be living 3 blocks from the local power plant? Should we not be near power lines? I'm making stuff up, but are there some environmental things that you think we've underestimated their deleterious impact?
Oh, definitely. Well, the power lines, I think, that used to be that was a kind of cancer scare some years ago, but studies then just showed that there was really no particular effect of power lines. So I wouldn't worry about that. And the same with, people used to worry about smartphones and so on. But those are not the things I would worry about. But there is general environmental pollution that is causing problems. It's less of an issue in America, although it is in some parts of the US as well. But for example, I just spent several weeks in India, and the air quality index in India is just horrible. And so you can imagine that in 20 or 30 years, you're going to have a whole generation of people who've had problems with their brain and especially their lungs, and they're going to come down with diseases prematurely, and they're going to age faster. So, and one real feature of modern life, I think, is stress. So, I pointed out that there are 3 things you can easily do, namely exercise, diet, and sleep. But our modern lifestyle makes all of those things harder. And in fact, if you're poorer, it's even harder, because you have to eat on the go. You might eat junk food, and you might be working 2 jobs, so you don't really have time to sleep, and you're stressed out all the time, and you certainly don't have time to exercise. So I think many of those things are easier for rich people to do than for people who are just trying to make ends meet. And there is this health disparity and longevity disparity between rich and poor. It's about 15 years in the US.
Can we decelerate the aging clock or even reverse it, or is that just like a pithy marketing line for a new nutraceutical product?
There are several really scientifically valid approaches None of them are quite ready in humans yet, but there are several approaches which attempt to combat different processes of aging. And many of them have had promising results in animals. Some of them involve taking various kinds of supplements because as we get older, we also lose our ability to make important biochemicals as efficiently. And so the levels of those biochemicals go down. And there's some idea that maybe if we supplement with those kinds of things, we can actually stay healthier. It's not clear that they'll extend our lives much, but it might keep us healthier. What you asked about was reversing the aging process, and that's more challenging. But there's some there's efforts in that direction, and that is people have figured out how to program cells, so to change their genetic program, so the cells sort of go backwards in development. So normal development is we start with a fertilized egg, the egg becomes a small embryo, and the embryo grows and eventually is a baby and then grows into an adult. That's the normal progression of things. And so you get all these cells that have finally differentiated and become skin cells or blood cells or bone or hair or whatever. But now, can you make those go backwards? Can you make those cells go slightly backwards? And that's an amazing thing that people have figured out how to make cells go somewhat backwards in development. And the question is whether this kind of treatment could actually reverse aging. Now, some of the more optimists in the field would say, yes, that's sort of what's happening. I don't think we're there yet, and I think it's going to be extremely challenging to do it in humans in a way that's safe and over the long term and so on. But it is a very exciting area of biology.
I'm going to end with a bit of a convoluted question, but you'll understand the essence, and I invite you to answer it any way you'd like to. I'm kind of at a loss for why so many people want to live longer. I mean, the world is daily a more increasingly dangerous place, fraught with anxiety and fear of death. I don't think that the quality of life is very good for most people past a certain age. My mother is in her 80s, and I visit her retirement home many times a week, and I have generally said, kind of over 86. I mean, it is a burden to a lot of people, regardless of your socioeconomic ability to make it easier. And there's also people that are religious and have a faith that there's something waiting for them on the other side, whatever that is. What is with the obsession for trying to extend life? Because even if you were to extend it by 2 or 5 or 10 years, is it really going to be that quality? Take that, Reverend, anywhere you'd like to go.
Well, I think the scientist's view would be that we've evolved not to want to die. We've been aware of our mortality. And of course, if we were pretty casual about dying, it would increase the chances that we would take risks or not do whatever we have to do to stay alive. So we have a deep inborn desire to live. And there's an old joke about who would want to live to be 100. And the answer is somebody who's 99. So most of us can philosophically accept that, one day we're going to die and it's going to be fine. But if you ask them, would you like to die tomorrow or next week? How about next month? How about in the next 5 years? Most people would say no. And in fact, if you offered people a pill and said, look, this is a pill that'll give you 10 years of healthy life. Nobody wants to be decrepit. But if you say, this pill is going to give you 10 years of extra healthy life, most of us would take it. I mean, why am I taking statins or blood pressure medicines? It's because I want to stay alive and healthy longer. And so I think that's an innate human desire. And I don't know if we can ever really change that. I think it's part of human nature.
And your colleague of friends, I interviewed Neil deGrasse Tyson about a year ago, and I asked him, what was the correlation to education and a belief in the afterlife? And he shared some pretty horrifying statistics that typically the more letters behind your name, the less likely you are to believe in, a God or a creator or a heaven or afterlife. In your circle of researchers and scientists, clearly as a Nobel Prize winner, you operate with very thoughtful people. Do you have anything to share around what you or your peers tend to think about what happens when your body dies that you might share with us just as a personal opinion?
Well, I want to point out most scientists today probably don't believe in an afterlife. I would probably say that. At least the most successful scientists I've seen, most of them tend not to. But it's not universal. And there are some brilliant scientists who are deeply religious. So, including Francis Collins, who was the head of the Human Genome Project at the NIH. So I don't sort of, hold that you have to believe this way or that way in order to be a good scientist. A good scientist, it's about examining evidence and going by that. The afterlife, the problem is there's no empirical evidence that a scientist would accept as evidence. And those are really matters of faith, and that's a different area of human belief.
Right.
And so I'm not sure that they quite intersect, and it's a very personal thing to people.
Yeah, certainly. I respect your answer. Thank you for letting me ask it. Okay, let's end. What are you excited about? What are you encouraged about that maybe most people don't know is in development, or is there, you write in the book about during the Clinton administration when they, of course, announced the grand spectacular human genome had been mapped and what that will do. Is there something on the horizon that you have great confidence in its efficacy or in its application to the lives of us who are alive today? Yeah. What's around the corner?
I think the ability to edit our genomes and also the edit genomes of plants and so on, that's going to really change change things in a great way, I think. It also has potential risks of being abused. But for example, many really horrible genetic diseases that people had no solution for, in theory, we could now correct those genetic diseases in many cases. And it's first been shown for sickle cell anemia, this genome editing thing. And there are other ways of correcting genetic defects. The other is that these genetic technologies can be very powerfully applied to tackle other diseases like cancer, even in the long run, these diseases of aging like diabetes and even dementia, hopefully. So I do think there's a lot going on. I think we're also making great strides in understanding how the brain works. And of course, there's this intersection of computer science with biology, which can make progress extremely fast compared to what it was before. So this is a very exciting time to be a scientist, I think.
So many questions about the impact machine learning and AI will have on research and the survivability of human race.
I mean, this year's Nobel Prize was for using AI in my field of structural biology, how to use AI to predict structures instead of having to painstakingly determine them in the lab. So AI is really accelerating discovery in many areas. And I think we're still at the very beginning of AI.
Certainly.
And so we have no idea where it'll go.
That might be your next book. Dr. Venki Ramakrishnan, winner of the Nobel Prize in Chemistry. Your book is Why We Die, The New Science of Aging and the Quest for Immortality. What a delight to have you on today. This could have been like a masterclass for several hours. So I appreciate you joining us today. Thank you, sir, for your contribution.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Our pleasure. And we'll see you back here next week for a new conversation on leadership.